Hey guys, welcome to Atheist Edge. I'm Jim. To your right there is Courtney. And there's TJ off camera. Get in the camera a little bit. There you are. And we have two special guests today. We have two very special guests today. Rex Burks and Owen Younger.
That is Rex.
Rex is on the right. Owen's on the left. Rex and Owen were both raised as devout fundamentalist Christians until reason and evidence eventually took over. Since leaving religion, they have both become enthusiastic students of the New Testament, the historical Jesus, and the early Christian church. For nearly 2 years, Bible in hand, they have been visiting a wide range of Christian denominations and joining Sunday school class discussions with believers. Rex is an attorney, and Owen is a pilot professionally. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
What got you guys interested in going back to the biblical text? Were you like really invested in it educationally?
No. I can't speak for Rex, but after having left Christianity late teens, just right before I left college, I became the angry atheist, and I went through a number of years where I was just mad at religion, and I kind of, as you grow up and you kind of mellow out, sort of that passes, and I had a lot of former fundamentalists who turned into atheists go through that phase, and it wasn't until some years later that I discovered Bart Ehrman and Burton Mack and a number of those authors that kind of explored the Bible from a scholarly perspective and not just a devotional perspective, and that was a new thing for me. And when I read Misquoting Jesus, I couldn't put it down, and I went through, in about a year, I went through the entire Ehrman library and then a whole bunch of others after that, and I found the Bible, and it's actually one of the things in some of our presentations, I found the Bible far more interesting as an atheist, just from a historical and cultural perspective, than I ever did as a Christian. As a Christian, you think about it, right? As a Christian, the Bible has one voice, right? The Bible has a single author. It's God.
Christians say the Bible says, the Bible says. The Bible says. Yeah. And you never hear atheists say that. You say Paul says this.
They read it as
the writer of Matthew says this.
Right. Yeah. And anyway, I'll let Rich.
No, so my experience was similar. It was a little later. So Owen detoxed in high school. I was actually 27.
Detoxed.
Okay, so I detoxed from Christianity when I was 27 years old, which meant I got all the way 4 years of Bible college and 3 more years after that. So in Bible college, we studied the Old Testament, we studied the New Testament, we studied the epistles of Paul. Each year we went through a different section of the Bible. So in 4 years, 8 semesters, we covered the whole Bible.
So you were studying for a PhD in fairyology?
No, I was actually an IT major. This is what everybody had to do. Everybody had to do Bible. I didn't even get a minor for this.
He went to God's college.
I went to God's college, which was the church college for God's one true church.
The one true
church. Right. This is what it was. Anyway,
and the one chosen to go for you.
But just to echo what Owen said, it was always the idea that the Bible's all saying the same thing. Right. And so, with a little nudge from Thomas Paine, just after my 27th birthday, I became an atheist by page 3 of The Age of Reason. And Paine asked a question that I had never asked, which was really, where'd the Bible come from? Yeah, where'd the Bible come from? We always started the act of doing religion was to read the Bible and do what it says, right? And if our church is following it better than your church, then we're right and you're wrong. But we never really asked the question, why Bible? And that's what Paine said. And the whole house of cards just crumbled because clearly the Bible is man-made. And there's abundant evidence that the Bible is man-made. But I had never asked the question, never thought about that. And so when I detoxed, I was surrounded by Christians. Everyone I knew was a Christian. All my family, all my neighbors, all my coworkers. And so I realized I didn't know my Bible. I knew they didn't know their Bible. Yeah. And so doing a deep dive into the literature on the early church and the historical Jesus and the canonization of the Bible and the theological differences between Paul and some of the gospel writers or between the gospel writers, this was fascinating to me because I knew what the word said, but I never put it in context. I never thought about the early church that was creating these because it just was a book that fell from the sky. And so some of the realizations that really moved me were, like, for example, just the realization that it was the 4th century before we even had this list of these 27 books.
Whatever was canonical.
That constitutes the New Testament,
yeah.
right. That centuries went by before the church even had a handle on what was the New Testament.
And it wasn't until 1100 years after that it was formally ordained as canon. I mean, they were using it.
Oh,
but nobody
I thought it was
considered Council of Trent.
Okay.
So
that's something
far later.
Yeah.
So yeah, but it's late 4th century before we even get this list. And even once we had this list, that wasn't universal. Some of the churches in North Africa were using different gospels, different epistles. And so that was one of those blood drain from the face moments, right? To realize this is so obviously man-made. Yeah. And then another thing is like a big part of my church growing up is that we followed all of the Old Testament and the New Testament. So we did kosher, we did tithing, we did Sabbath, sundown to sundown, Friday to Saturday. We kept Saturday Sabbath.
Seventh-day Adventists?
Well, it was sort of a spit-off from that. So we were Christians. We believed that Jesus died for our sins and was going to return again, but we also believed that the law of the Old Testament was still in force. And so we did not keep Christmas or Easter. We kept the holy days in Leviticus, all of that. And so the realization that Paul, who's the one who's, the first New Testament writer who's trying to do away with this Jewish law, he had a very different theology than maybe like the writer of Matthew, who's, has on Jesus' lips very clearly that nothing's going to pass away from the law.
Right.
And that's
until everything is fulfilled.
And so Paul even acknowledges this conflict in the early church. In his letters to the Corinthians and the Galatians, he's talking about, don't listen to those Christians that come behind me and teach you that you have to circumcise and follow the law.
He rails on the Judaism.
Right, so he's acknowledging that even that early on, there's this tension in the early church. And so it really just happens, it's a historical quirk that the Paul's version of Christianity won out and became Orthodox.
Well, I don't think that's a historical.
Well, it's the only one that would have won out because the Greeks were not going to buy into circumcision.
Right, that's the only path that could possibly have converted the Greeks.
Surely.
What's your take on why would it be included in the Bible that all these people were so contradictory to one another? Then why would it be included? What purpose could that have served?
I don't think anyone noticed. It's not like these books were written at the same time.
No,
I think there's one community somewhere that's more Jewish that's got Matthew. There's another community somewhere that's more mystical that's got John. Centuries later, these get bound together, and now the church doesn't have anything earlier. So we have this whole body of what we call theology, which is really trying to harmonize things that aren't harmonizing.
Then the question becomes how because as skeptics we have to look at these things as how do you reconcile these contradictions?
Well, I don't have to. I can see them.
No, we don't. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, the Christians do.
The onus, the entire burden of demonstrating things is on them, but they don't do that.
Of course.
The answer, for them, the answer is that there was one voice that wrote the Bible, and that was God using the vessels.
Well, you'll hear, for example, the Gospels are all anonymous, but you'll hear them sort of in defending these traditional John, Mark, Matthew, Luke, this authorship. They'll say, oh, well, these were either people who knew Jesus or knew the apostles, and so they had different viewpoints, right? So God is preserving different viewpoints. It's silliness. Because for instance, Mark and John don't even agree on what day Jesus died. Right. Of course it is. Of course it is.
I'm kind of curious. There was a kind of a biblical scholar interview that Thinking Atheist did a long time ago. It was a 2.5-hour thing. I'm pretty sure it was that podcast. But it was an interview about people who had studied this stuff a lot, so I'm kind of curious what you guys have to say about this. It was a claim that that the Bible, when it was written, wasn't written as something to be taken literally, because the time that it was written in is something that's more about folklore.
How do you determine when you take it literally and when you?
But the details and having them contradict wasn't really the purpose. It was about the moral behind it, and people believing in it now are being too literal about it, and it wasn't. And it was even argued that it wasn't even supposed to be something that was believed to be true and literal and historical, but it's more just a tale because of the religious texts in the time were valued in that way instead of the way that they are today. So I was curious.
I think that's a modern view. I think that if you could be in the first century and talk to first century Christians, I think they believed it literally. Now there were different communities that believed different things. I don't know that you would have find anyone who believes everything in the Bible, because there were Christians who didn't want the Old Testament to be part of the new religion at all. And there are Christians, obviously the community that created the Gospel of John, where Jesus is walking around claiming to be God, might look very different theologically
did
than
Jesus claim to be God in the Bible?
In John.
In John, he certainly does. And
It's called Christology, and it goes, starting with Mark, it's very low Christology.
Sure.
It's very
Like
high.
what was the exact, like, do you remember what the exact, like...
I and the Father are one. I mean, this is, in the beginning was the
Right,
Word.
but
and
he
the Word
never
was
says,
God.
like, I am God, like, specifically.
He
No,
says he's
Well, he's not speaking in English, so he wouldn't say that. No, you can definitely see the myth growing, though. I mean, if you look at Mark, about half the time Jesus talks about the coming Messiah, he speaks in third person. Like, he's not even talking about himself.
Yeah,
So Mark is the earliest gospel.
And it's, like, detached, like...
Right, he's like John the Baptist. He's one preaching a coming Messiah. Flash forward a decade or so, and you get Luke and Matthew, where Jesus is clearly claiming to be the Messiah who's going to return, but he doesn't identify himself as God. And then flash forward to John, and he claims to be God. And so you go from a Messiah is coming, but it's not me, to I am the Messiah, to I am, and you see the progression growing.
What's that meme where it's like, my favorite part of the Bible is where God, or Jesus is talking to himself.
Right.
God.
Well, that's a great.
And nobody's there.
That's a great
like,
point. It's called the omniscient narrator.
Like,
and it happens
nobody's there,
often.
but somehow there's an account of it,
Like
right?
the Garden of Gethsemane, where
you know what I'm saying? Yeah.
here's what the apologists.
He's talking to himself, but nobody like is
Well,
there
so think
to
about,
write.
or like this trial in John, and he's this long narrative with Pilate, right? And there's this long
Like,
narrative.
who's there writing
Right.
that?
There's no one in the room but him and Pilate, and so I don't think Pilate bothered to write it.
Yeah, I don't think Pilate did that.
The apologists will tell you with a straight face that this is all first-hand eyewitness testimony.
Yeah,
It
ridiculous.
Well, or that God dictated it later to John.
Well, listen to the mental gymnastics they use on the garden. They said there was a group of his disciples there nearby. And I've actually heard an apologist say they were close enough to where they heard Jesus praying. They heard what he was saying to God.
But I thought he was completely isolated. Like that was the narrative. That was the narrative.
And twice in the Bible it says that they kept falling asleep. That they were stone cold asleep during all this.
Right.
Yeah.
Jesus had to go and admonish them and wake them up to stand watch.
Yeah.
Twice.
Right. But you know, you're importing the synoptics into John when you make that leap, and,
Right,
and I think
right.
these were two completely different books. No, but I want to get back to this point about how the liberals, Christians, will talk about the Bible differently than the fundamentalists.
Well, and
and
this is an atheist perspective of it too.
Well, so this idea that it was never meant to be literal. Well, first of all, there's a lot of different it. You know, Jews do this too now. Jews will say, "Oh, well, you Christians are silly." You know, talking like the Ken Ham crowd, right? You're silly to think about the flood and creation in literal terms. This is clearly
Right.
just a story.
Literalism.
But I really think what's going on there is you've got very modern Jews that obviously are very secular, and they're seeing this as metaphorical. That doesn't mean that a Jew in Jesus' time in the first century would have seen the Bible as metaphorical. I think they thought it was literal history.
Weren't the first converts Jews anyway? I mean, like they
Well,
were
Probably the very first ones, but
Yeah.
not Paul's crowd. I think that Paul's crowd was the one that went out and became Orthodox.
You think they were probably just
Well,
Greek?
Greek-speaking, Roman Empire,
Pantheists.
pagans, non-Jews.
Pagans, yeah.
They would have been pagan converts.
But this idea that we're going to import modern Judaism into first century Judaism and then import that into Christianity, it's really just, it always plays in my head like it's a move by a liberal Christian to try to not have to own the text.
Right.
But I mean, there's some clues that this is not the way they thought. Look at Luke. The Gospel of Luke has a genealogy.
Right.
Yeah, he does a genealogy of Joseph that goes all the way back to Adam, the first man.
So how do you explain the two
So he believed
differing like genealogies?
I explained it that
Because
they
there
were
were two
aware of each
different
other.
They
ones,
weren't
They
right?
were aware of each other.
They weren't aware of each other.
It's a contradiction.
It's an evidence
Genetic
that all of the
That's made
writings
up.
are man-made. They are
yeah.
written by humans.
Right. You need to ask Christians these questions.
Right. These, yeah.
I'll tell you what we said. I'll tell you
I'm
what we
just
said.
asking because I want to get your like.
So
take on it.
here's what I said when I was in Bible college. I said, and was taught to say, well, one of them is the genealogy of Joseph, and one is the genealogy of Mary. Well, it's silly
But
because they both clearly say they're the genealogy of Joseph.
Say
Right.
Joseph.
Right.
Yeah.
Who isn't even the dad, right?
Yeah.
It's not-
Well, but and the atheists kind of making that argument is there's a couple of atheist biblical scholars, and they are these historians or something, but it was kind of looking at the context of even the resurrection, things that you would be required to believe in to consider yourself Christian, that those things were not supposed to be taken as historical in the time. That the value in it was different.
Yeah, but that's what.
And because it would have been obvious that it was. That they were talking about this too. That there were other texts that were so similar at the time, and tailoring it to what this group of people would have valued and the type of culture that they were wanting to promote. That was why certain things were included and changed from previous texts. And so it's a copy of those things, and a very obvious copy, especially because it was a new copy of something everybody already knew. So the only reason adopting it would have been, this reflects our values and what we want to believe in, but they wouldn't have taken it as, oh, this is now what happened in the history of the world. They wouldn't have thought of it that way. So that's what they were arguing.
So I think yes and no. I think that the earliest Christians, or Jesus followers, or whatever they call themselves, who would have actually known the human Jesus, which I know is an open question, but for sake of argument, let's say there was a human Jesus. Yeah. The people who knew the human Jesus knew damn well he didn't get out of the grave, because no one gets out of graves. No. And so I believe that the earliest Jesus followers that came to see him in some sense raised were thinking that he's now with God, in some spiritual sense, not a bodily rising from an empty tomb. In fact, the best scholarship well, that came decades later. The best scholarship, though, shows that the Romans were adamant about leaving the body on the cross and let the birds and the dogs eat the body, because that was part of the humiliation, part of the fear tactic. They would not have said, okay, your day's over, you can have the body now and bury him.
It was the start of the Sabbath,
the Romans didn't care about that.
What would the Romans care about?
No. Was it common? Can we look at Roman history, and was it common for the Romans in that era to concede to the Jews and to bring them down off the cross?
No, not at all. In fact, it was deliberately brutal to keep the peace, especially at a time like Passover, when the population of Jerusalem is swelling.
If you go back and look at history, Pilate was actually removed from office because he was being too hard on the Jews. He was being too hard for them to get along with.
And we get a little of that from Josephus too.
So and the Romans removed it.
Yeah, Pilate worked for the Romans. So if we can start with the premise that the people who knew Jesus, if he existed and if he was crucified, knew that he didn't actually bodily rise the way that the Gospels describe.
Yeah, the rock wasn't moved away.
So if we know this didn't happen, but we know that the myth grew and grew and grew to the point where you've got a cadaver walking around talking to people.
What about the 500? The holy men that were supposedly witnessed by 500 citizens?
It's a blurb from Corinthians, right? So what we have is nothing. We have nothing written by Jesus. We have nothing written by anyone who knew Jesus. No. We have stuff written decades later. And so the earliest of those decades later is Paul. And what does Paul tell us? Paul tells us that Jesus rose and appeared.
Vision.
Appeared to the 12, and then appeared to 500, and then later, as one untimely born, appeared to me. Now, so Paul tells us that he appeared to me, but Paul doesn't describe a bodily interaction.
No,
Paul describes a visionary.
And
he doesn't describe the acts event either, so forget about Damascus. And so Paul's visionary view of Jesus is the same verb that he uses when he's describing how Jesus appeared to the earlier ones. It's not a bodily resuscitation. Only later, as the story gets told and retold and eventually put into the Gospels, then we get zombie Jesus walking around.
But see, my question is like, if the Damascus Road experience is good enough for Paul, why isn't it good enough for
Paul never describes that experience.
So that's not Paul, right? That's the author.
Acts tells us that story. Paul never says anything like that.
Why do we get that? Why do we get that?
We can't.
Why can't we have
I don't think Paul had it either.
I don't think there's
and because it's a made-up story.
There's no reason to accept Acts as historical. It is a fictional account to try and account for the actions, the acts of the apostles after.
Well, and to really reconcile that very Gentile approach from that very Christian.
And there's another, in fact, we've got a blog post on it. There's a dichotomy between Jesus's Christianity and what the followers of Jesus would have believed and what Paul was teaching. This goes back to the problem of ultimately of circumcision. And Paul is railing, and all of his churches railing on the Judaizers that are saying that in order to be a good Christian, first you've got to be a Jew.
Cut the tip of your dick off.
Right. So, and clearly Paul's understanding of Christianity is the only one that could possibly be successful. You'll hear apologists say things like, Christianity wound up spreading through the Roman Empire precisely because it was true. They'll argue that the fact that because it was true, when the truth is that Paul is teaching a version of Christianity that is softer than the apocalyptic Judaism would have been teaching, and he's saying it's okay not to do all of the Jewish laws.
Well, but so here's an interesting thing about that is that Paul, we know Paul is against circumcision, right? That's in Leviticus. We know Paul is still in favor of the prohibitions on homosexuality. He makes that clear in Romans.
Right.
So all the times that Paul talks about the law being done away with, he never really spells out which parts are in and which parts are out. And so we assume
It was the 613.
that things like the Sabbath, which was important to Orthodox Jews in the first century and now, we assume Paul wasn't forcing the Gentile converts to keep the Sabbath, but he never really specifically addresses it. We assume he wasn't forcing them to keep kosher, but he never really specifically says. We know he's against homosexuality, and we know he's against the requirement of circumcision, but there's a lot of gray area, a lot of other sort of laws from the Old Testament.
We think it would not be so nebulous.
Right.
For it to be, this is codified.
Right.
This is your chance to get it right.
But Paul didn't think he was writing the Bible. Paul thought he was writing occasional letters back to his churches.
One of the questions I'd like to ask Christians is if you could talk to Paul and ask him, do you think that your words are the inspired divine guidance that's coming directly from Yahweh and you're just a vessel? Are you aware that you are writing the Bible? I think Paul would say, no, I'm writing a letter to the church in Corinth.
Right. Right, of
I
course.
think that's what he would say.
Yep.
Atheist Edge. Walking the edge of what some consider offensive. But your feelings don't matter here, only facts. Edgy commentary on the dangers of doctrine, the foibles of faith, the bullshit of belief, the stupidity of superstition, and the idiocy of indoctrination. With razor-sharp wit, curiosity, and critical thought, we take an unblinking look at today's religions. We are Atheist Edge.